Colonel Wilkerson, could you tell us a little bit about your career as it began in the 1990s with Colin Powell, working for Colin Powell, and your
Sure.
position with him and what he was doing?
Sure. I joined him at U.S. Forces Command, which at the time was the command that had all of the Army forces in the continental United States and its territories under its reserve, National Guard, and everything. But 5.5 months later, remember he'd been Deputy National Security Advisor and National Security Advisor to Ronald Reagan. So he knew the Vice President Reagan had, George H.W. Bush, very well. So about 5 months later, he gets a call, and he's going to be the next chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. So I accompanied him up to Washington in that chairmanship. That 4 years led to 3 years with him in a private capacity where we did all manner of things. And then after those 3 years in a private capacity, he asked me to join him at the State Department once George W. Bush had been determined the winner of the election by the Supreme Court. Very truncated transition, which was very dangerous, I found. And I became a policy planner at my own wish. He wanted me to stay close to him, but I said I want to go over and work for Richard Haas as a policy planner, at least for 18 months or so. And he let me. And then one day, about 18 months later, he asked me to come be his chief of staff. And so I finished up the last almost 3 years as his chief of staff at the State Department. So we went through some really tortured times. We fought the Vice President and the Secretary of Defense on almost every decision, almost every policy, from state-sanctioned torture, a war crime, clearly a war crime. Powell's lawyer even told Donald Rumsfeld it was a war crime, Will Taft, to rape, pillage, and plunder in Iraq, where we essentially set up a process whereby hundreds of thousands of Iraqis were killed or wounded. Millions were either internally or externally displaced, made refugees inside their country or outside their country. Still, many of them are refugees. And set Iraq on a path of chaos for years to come. It still is. I did an Al Hura interview for State Department a couple of nights ago, and the Lebanese interviewer asked me on the 20th anniversary of the 2003 invasion of Iraq what I thought the condition of Iraq was, and I said, a disaster. And they translated that into Arabic, and his eyes got big, and he looked at me and he said, could you expand? And I expanded much the way I just did with you, all these people we killed, and to no end other than chaos. And I elaborated on the disaster for Syria, the disaster for the whole region, how we empowered Iran, how the IRGC had become the kingmaker in Iran because of the power we gave it by taking out Saddam Hussein. And at the end of the interview, the most peculiar thing happened. He got out of his chair, cameras were off, sound was down. He got out of his chair and he came over and he shook my hand and he said, thank you for being the first person to tell the truth on this show. And I went out to the producer for Middle East Broadcasting Network. I'd helped set that up when I was working for Powell. We spent $400 million on a television station. And they told us, you'll never get any audience share from Al Arabiya, Al Jazeera, and the BBC. You'll never steal their audience share because you'll be politicking. And they don't largely politic. If it is politicking, it's behind the scene, it's subliminal. They just report the news and so forth, and they understand the Arab world, so you'll never get their audience share. So I looked at the producer who had invited me over, who I know pretty well, and I said, Susan, now you know why you don't have any audience share. She said, what do you mean? I said, because the guy told me I was the first person to get on that camera and tell the truth. You got to tell the truth, at least in part, to these people in the area because they know the truth. They live it every day. And so when you lie to them, they're not going to tune you in. They're not going to listen to your TV or your radio Sol. We set that up too.
So you've told us how this happened a lot, the politics behind going to war against Iraq. But could you just go over that a little bit, and including with some of the people around, Dick Cheney and David Addington or whoever you dealt with?
Well, my students on two campuses, George Washington University and William and Mary, have done numerous case studies on this. So I now have not the telescopic view of the Secretary of State or his Chief of Staff, but I have the comprehensive view of all the archives and such that my students have gone through and built a case. I told the Deputy Secretary of State, Rich Armitage, recently, I said, Rich, I know more about the first Bush administration than you'll ever know. He was kind of taken aback. I said, I've had some brilliant students lecture me on it from the archives. I've seen the original documents and so forth. He said, ugh. And what I've learned from that is several things. We had an extraordinarily, like Clinton, at least Clinton in his first 2 years, inexperienced president. Very dangerous thing. Probably the most dangerous thing you can do is put a country bumpkin in the White House. And that's what we did with both Bill Clinton and George W. Bush, regardless of their daddies or his sophistication. His sophistication was largely in going out and finding women through the Arkansas State Police to bed. So that's dangerous. And these people made messes of their administrations early on. Well, Bush made a mess of his first 4 years. And he let his vice president run him ragged. But there were so many reasons for going to war in Iraq that my students would go up at the end of their case studies and put on the whiteboard anywhere from 8 to 12 reasons, and then put the people beside each one of the reasons to whom they attributed that being an influence. And it was everything from oil for Israel, which I've since learned from Gary Vogler, our main oil man in Iraq, was truly a motivation. Doug Feist's office door was largely closed under Secretary of Defense for policy, while Mossad and Mossad's contacts, both in the country and in the region, came and went from that office and made policy under the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, Douglas Feist. So it was. I actually found out from Gary Vogler, the Exxon executive for a long time, whom we sent to Iraq for 6 years, as I recall, to help the oil ministry. I also learned from him that Paul Wolfowitz actually changed the targeting for Tommy Franks without Rumsfeld's knowledge to bomb a certain target in Syria, because that was a message to the Syrians to keep the discounted oil flowing to Haifa. So that's one reason. It was Israel, and it had all kinds of ramifications other than oil, but that was the main one. Delve into that story for a minute, and you find Mark Rich. Mark Rich, who was pardoned in his last hour, literally in the Oval Office by Bill Clinton, an ignominious act, and people accused him of that at the time, who knew the record. Mark Rich was buying oil from Saddam Hussein, violating the sanctions, and selling it to Israel at discounted prices. He went to jail for it. He was a crook. But Clinton pardoned him at the end. Well, guess who was getting money from Mark Rich as his legal advisor? $4 million at one point. Scooter Libby, the chief of staff to the vice president of the United States. So when my students dig into all this stuff, they come up with all these nefarious reasons for all this stuff going on. Take torture. It wasn't just John Yoo that created state-sponsored, a rationale for state-sponsored torture. It was David Addington in the vice president's office. John Hanna, David Addington, a number of people in Feist's office, most of whom have real strong ties to Israel, all created this milieu in the vice president's office that created false intelligence, fed it to the New York Times. When the New York Times printed it, they then quoted it the next day. The vice president in a speech or something would quote it as finished intelligence. It was an operation par excellence. I mean, they built the war cry, if you will, and they built it based on specious evidence, both hard intelligence and what I would call manufactured intelligence. And they built it on the attachment of Saddam Hussein with 9/11 in the minds of the American people. Powell even says that at the UN on February 5th, 2003. And they built it on the backs of all the people in America who had some reason or another, whether it was their interest in Israel or destabilizing the region, or Bush's genuine interest, I think, in bringing democracy to the region, as stupid as that looks in hindsight, and as stupid as it probably is. All these things kludged together with a president who had no experience whatsoever, and a vice president who was a bureaucratic entrepreneur par excellence, and produced a condition of decision-making that was just so abnormal, so aberrated, so focused on the vice president that one has to say he was president for national security, and he wanted a war. And so we wound up getting a war. And there are other motivations in there, like Bush was really angry about Saddam having tried to kill his father. There were people who thought, yeah, if we bring Christianity to Iraq, we will fix things, you know. And if we bring democracy with it, we'll fix things. And then there were people who wanted to destabilize, like Richard Pearl, who wanted to destabilize the whole Middle East because they thought that would protect Israel. If you get everybody down, if you get Iran down, Syria down, Iraq down, all the potential threats to Israel, then Israel will be fine. You got them all in chaos. Israel's fine. Israel can build itself within that chaos.
General Wesley Clark is on YouTube speaking at the Commonwealth Club of how he found out almost immediately after 9/11 that this group of people planned to take 7 countries down in succession. When did you become aware of that, or did you become aware of it during those times?
The first thing Richard did with me of significance, because I was the only member on about a 35-member policy planning staff, which was some of the best people I've ever worked with.
That's Richard who?
This is Richard Haas, Director of Policy Planning. Ambassador Richard Haas. He was Special Envoy to Ireland for the peace talks, and he was Director of Policy Planning at State. And he put together a policy planning staff that was, like I said, some of the best people I've ever worked with, really smart people. But none of them had military experience except me. So he said, I want you to do what George Marshall did. I want you to start joint staff talks, policy planning oriented, with the Pentagon. So I went over, met General Casey, who was then the J5. I knew General Casey, George Casey. And I said, this is what we want to do. He said, bingo, man, let's do it. Let's do it. Let's have our first set next week, okay? China, want to do China? I said, that's a great first topic. So we began policy planning talks. He put a colonel in charge of the actual action at the table. I was in charge of the action at the table for State, and we met. And we talked about China. He didn't endear himself to the State Department people because he walked into the room the first meeting and said, well, we're going to talk about the Chi-Coms today. And one of the State people said, General, I don't think we call them that anymore. Anyway, okay, says the General. He left. We had a good set of policy planning talks on China. Then we did North Korea. Then we did the Middle East in general. Focusing on Iraq, because Powell's first order from the president was to smarten up the sanctions on Iraq, because we knew that they were hurting Iraqi children. They were hurting people that didn't need to be hurt, and people we wanted to be hurt, like Saddam and his family, weren't being hurt. They still had plenty of money through the UN Oil for Food program, which incidentally is where Mark Rich was getting a lot of that oil from Saddam Hussein with the UN money. So that was our principal mission with regard to the Middle East. Well, this went on for about 6 weeks, and in the course of that 6 weeks, I wandered around the Pentagon with Colonel Rock and a number of others who were helping me with the staff talks, and I see all this policy planning going on. It's war planning. And so I'm asking him, I said, this is a contingency plan with tip-fid data. You know what time, phase, force, and deployment data means. It can go into the computer. It means you're probably going to use it. Okay. Because it's really painstaking to do all that logistic data that has to go into the computer. So you leave it as a concept plan, and you don't tip fit it. Because you think, well, I got it if I have to, and I can tip fit it at the last minute. But I'm not going to take it down and do it now because it's a lot of labor for something that'll probably. I got one for Britain. You know, I'm not going to take that one down and do it because I'm probably not going to fight Britain again. You know? Anyway, I'm looking at all these plans that are tip fitted. Syria.
And this was what year?
This was 2000. This was before 9/11. This is summer of 2001. Same time, Richard and I were doing policy planning talks with Wang Yi in Beijing. Wang Yi, the now state counselor, foreign minister for China. So we're working a whole lot of things at that time. We're doing policy planning with China, policy planning with Korea, Japan, the whole Northeast Asia group, and we're also doing policy planning with the Pentagon. And so, as you might imagine, since we were going to do those policy planning talks in country with the others, the subjects of our first talks were those countries and Northeast Asia in general. Once I had seen these plans, I began to wonder what the hell was going on. And so I began to ask some questions. And I found out that most of this was emanating out of Fife's office, this war planning. Well, about that time, almost coincidental with that, in fact, it was no more than 24 hours after I found out about Syria, I get word through Richard, and he's absolutely blunderstruck by it, Rumsfeld's ordered us out of the Pentagon. You mean I made the people over there so angry that they don't want me to come back? He's ordered us to stop policy planning talks. Oh, and by the way, he's also ordered the recovery of every military officer working in the State Department, on the Hill, and everywhere else where he says they should not be. He wants them back. He started pulling them back from the Senate Armed Services Committee, the House Armed Services. He pulled them back from everywhere. He just reached out, blanket order, colonels, lieutenant colonels, generals, come back. Liaisons to the Congress for the services, he just pulled them all back in the Pentagon. And he said, sit down, I'm going to justify whether you should be where you are. Well, in political military affairs of state, for example, we're involved in status of forces agreement negotiations, military treaty type things. Well, you know about them. Mm-hmm. And we don't have any military officers, so Powell was furious. So what I did, I didn't get to participate in that fury, but what I did was I called Colonel Rock personally. I said, hey, we can't do this. This is really stupid. You really want to divorce diplomacy and the military and diplomacy? We just put us together. We're doing pretty well. This is stupid. He said, you're right. We're going over to Crystal City and we're going to bring in all the old guys, the retired admirals, generals and such, and we're going to critique the national military strategy we just produced. First thing I said was, Colonel, you produce the national military strategy before we have a national security strategy from the president? Because we didn't have one yet. He said, oh yeah, we always get ahead of the horse. I said, okay, so we're going to critique a strategy that is based on a strategy from the president. Well, we think we know what they're going to say because we've got Frank Miller on the NSC and he's feeding us stuff about what Condi's going to put in the national security strategy. Well, it didn't come out until late 2000. So we're a year ahead with the NMS. Anyway, I went to Crystal City and took a couple of my staffers with me. We sat down and we helped them critique their national military strategy for 2 days in Crystal City. The end of the second day, Colonel Rock comes up to me in the corridor and he says, I'm sorry. I'm going to shut this down entirely now because I've just come out on the brigade command list and Rumsfeld has made it absolutely clear that he thinks this is shut down. And if I get caught doing this, I'll get pulled off the list probably. I fully understand. I don't want to jeopardize your career now, but let's stay on the telephone. Oh yeah, okay, of course. Killed it entirely. And it was 6 to 8 months later that Rumsfeld relented, had checked all these people. He hadn't done crap. He just started filtering them back to the Hill first, as you might imagine, because there were senators and representatives who were hollering at him. And then he sent them back to Paul Mill and other places. But we never reconstituted the Joint Staff. So I got kicked out of the Pentagon. I could hardly go back. If I showed my ID card at the river entrance, they would check me doubly long and doubly hard. So, I was state. I wasn't military anymore. I was state. I was the enemy.
So, and this was still before 9/11.
This was the summer of 2001, yeah. We did the Beijing policy planning talks in July in Beijing. We did the Japan, Korea, Australia talks in conjunction with those in late June, early July. We just made a Canberra, Hong Kong, Beijing, Tokyo, Seoul, Jeju-do.
So during this time, was Rumsfeld and DOD still going on with the war planning?
As far as I know, I had inclinations of that, or indications of that, because Richard was friends with Condi, and they talked on the phone every other day, sometimes every day. And we had a meeting every morning at 8:30. If Richard didn't do it, Don Steinberg, the deputy, did it. Richard would do it unless he was traveling. And in those meetings, sometimes the two Iraq desk officers, or I shouldn't say desk officers, they weren't desk officers, the two Middle East specialists, Rob Deneen and Flint Leverett, usually sat up on the right front. And I remember vividly, I wasn't all that interested in that area. I'd told Powell my area was Northeast Asia, China, Japan, Korea. But I worked other areas. And they came to me sort of because I was the oldest man, and they knew that I was emailing Powell every day. So they knew they had, even Richard knew he had another conduit into the secretary when he talked to me. So they would gravitate to my office at night, and we'd sit down about 7 o'clock or so, and we'd yak about the day, you know. So all of a sudden, Rob and Flint are staying in my office a lot, and they're talking about, have you heard? We're going to go to war with Iraq. What? Yeah, we're going to go to war with Iraq, and maybe others. And this started rang some bells up here, you know, war planning I'd seen over there earlier. And so by the fall of 2001, after 9/11, you know, 9/11 sucked all the air out of the room for a couple of weeks, but then we got back meeting normally, and we're back talking about going to war with Iraq periodically. And of course, Rob and Flint and the others who were involved in any way with the Middle East, the girl who was, woman who was, can't remember her name now, but she was quite good on Russia, and that was her specialty, was Russia. She would join in sometimes too, because she had this theory, later proven pretty accurate, that Russia was really worried about the Islamic threat from the south, whether it was their own border territories, which had fallen out after the Soviet Union fell apart, or whether it was further south. They were worried about it. Genuine worries about Islamic terrorism and such seeping up from Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, you know. So she stayed plugged into the business about Iran and Iraq too. And they would talk. What are we doing? Well, this is crazy. Why are we doing this? Who's pushing this? What's going on? And it became pretty apparent by the time Tommy Franks gets his orders from Bush that he should start war planning for Iraq, and this is November of 2001, that we're planning on going to Iraq. And I knew personally from Powell's debriefings and from emails we'd exchanged that this was not what George W. Bush wanted to do. All this bullshit about Dick Clark meeting him and him saying, I'm going to, that's crap. He didn't want to take his eye off Afghanistan until Afghanistan looked like it was done. And he knew that the CIA was running Afghanistan, really, at that time. The Army wasn't running Afghanistan, the CIA was. That never changed, really, over the entire time. CIA never lost its contacts with the ISI, never allowed the military to do things that would in any way impinge upon their relationship with the ISI. So Petraeus, for example, and Karzai could not even try warlords for drug offenses and bribery and other things if the CIA objected, and they most often did, because these people they felt were their links to the ISI. So the people running Afghanistan, and this has got to come out in history at some time, were the CIA, not the military. Not NATO, not the U.S. military. They were subservient to the CIA. And therefore they were subservient to a degree to the real power, the ISI, Pakistan.
Your students, so you knew this when it was going on, or you
I suspected it when it was going on, and I started reading Steve COL and other people, and started listening to my students when they would go off and talk about other things like Afghanistan, like Pakistan, like the relationship between Pakistan and India, Kashmir, and so forth, because they could pick almost any crisis or potential crisis to do their case studies on. And I began to dig a little deeper, and I began to understand why, and I think if you interviewed Steve, he'd tell you this, why Afghanistan was such an imponderable situation, and why it looked like neither the Brits, NATO, nor the U.S. could make up their minds on things like, do we go after drugs or do we not go after drugs? Do we go after the poppy farmers or do we not go after the poppy farmers? And so you had the Brits in one region eradicating the opium poppies, and you had us in other regions paying people so they could afford to raise the opium poppies. And the warlords were ecstatic here and apoplectic over here and causing all sorts of trouble. So it was not a consistent policy. It was a mishmash of policies, but the one constant was the CIA and their relationship with the ISI. Sarah Chase writes all about this in her book, Thieves of State. She talks about going to the courtroom with the number one warlord in Afghanistan in terms of money created from drug sales very destabilizing guy with regard to the regions, especially Kandahar. Going to the courtroom with Karzai and Petraeus to try this guy in an Afghan court, and he was going to go to jail, and they were going to throw away the key. And the CIA intervened at the courtroom door and got him out over the president's objections and Petraeus's objections.
So it tells you who really runs the country, maybe.
In terms of Afghanistan, you're absolutely right. It was the agency. And it started at the beginning. I mean, they got in first. They were already there, of course, with Massoud and the Northern Alliance. Jawbreaker is an accurate book. They were there. They actually had control of the reins of manipulation of the Northern Alliance, and Dostum and others who joined eventually. The military's biggest worry at the time, we had F-16s and other airplanes delivering ordnance in accordance with ground lasers and such. Those were all special forces, very little military power other than the planes dropping the bombs. We were worried sick that the Northern Alliance was going to invest Kabul, and we would not have done anything except drop a few bombs and put some CIA on the ground, a few soldiers, and we'd be looking at another situation where warlords own Kabul. And we'd have to take it. We'd have to invade and take it. And all of a sudden, they decided, I think it was mostly Dostum and people like him, they decided that, hey, we just saw a display of firepower that was awesome. We were the one wielding it mostly, but we needed these SF guys with their handheld lasers and such, and we certainly needed those planes up there. Maybe we shouldn't contest them, so let's make a deal. And that's when we finally got enough troops in there, in that interregnum, while they were pondering it, we got enough troops in there for the Army to claim some kind of territory and to begin to get people and logistics in there to actually run the country, or try to run the country. About all they ever ran, really, was Kabul. Herat, Kandahar, other places like that were subject to the Taliban's whims.
When did you first begin hearing about the black sites and the torture that the CIA was doing?
Yeah. I knew something was going on when I went to the first and second and third or so meetings in the deputies conference room, which is what the secretary uses for his big meetings. You've got everybody in there, about anywhere from 25 to 50 people, depending. It's the assistant secretaries, the undersecretaries, the office heads, the director of USAID, and so they're all in there every morning. So when I became chief, I started going in there. But I was going in there intermittently for Richard, because when he couldn't make it, he would send me. And I began hearing about these people coming back from Afghanistan into a place called Guantanamo Bay. And I knew a little bit about Guantanamo from my knowledge of Cuba and what we'd done there. And I knew a little bit about what we had used, things like Diego Garcia and Guantanamo for before, outside the law. Cubans aren't interfering. We can do anything we want to there. Same with Diego Garcia. The British didn't register any complaints as long as we didn't make it public. So I said to myself, I said, well, okay, so we're going to set a prison up on Cuba, on Guantanamo, and we're going to send people. And then I started hearing the stories about these people coming back. And I heard the stories from people like Pierre Prosper, who was our ambassador at large for war crimes. And Pierre would come into the meetings and he would say, Mr. Secretary, we're bringing all these people back to Guantanamo in orange jumpsuits and shackled, hoods over their head and all that kind of stuff. And I can't tell you that any of them are guilty of anything, because we haven't had any combat status review tribunals or anything like we do in a normal war zone. We're just picking them up based on some Pakistani's $5,000 bounty and identification of his worst enemy as being a Taliban or Al-Qaeda worse, and packing them off. I suspect right now that of 742 people, that figure sticks in my head, I'd have to look at my notes, of 742 people that we've accumulated down there now, 2/3 of them haven't done anything except get caught. They're not guilty of being Al-Qaeda or terrorists or anything like that. They just got caught either in Pakistan, Uzbekistan, Afghanistan, or whatever. And Powell was like, well, go to Rumsfeld. Go to Rumsfeld. Same time, Jack Straw starts weighing in from England and makes himself an annoyance with Powell, because he's saying, I hear you've got some British citizens down there. and you won't let us have them. What, are we not a good enough ally? Do you not think we can be draconian enough? Do you not think we have prisons? Do you not think we can take care of these people? We want our citizens repatriated, and pretty soon it was other countries that had people down there. So Powell starts to get interested in it, in the sense that, one, his war crimes ambassador is telling him, and Pierre denies this now, denies it. I was sitting right there and heard him talking. He denies, he said Rumsfeld was the problem. He most certainly did say Rumsfeld was the problem. He couldn't get to Rumsfeld. He couldn't get him to say boo about whether or not he knew this. And if he did know it, why he wasn't doing something about it, that these people were fundamentally innocent. That went on for a long time, with almost every morning Powell bitching at Pierre, and Pierre answering back that there was nothing we could do. The preeminent cabinet department in the government was an obstacle. And, he was right. And then I began hearing these stories from people, probably people like you, some whom I'd known before who were in the JAG Corps, or some who were in the Pentagon, and hearing about some of the things that were going on. And I began to understand finally that when George Bush put those, I think it was 14 hardcore, he called them hardcore terrorists, Rumsfeld called them high value detainees, HVDs, down there, finally, when he took them out of the secret prisons. That's when I learned about the secret prisons, from the New York Times, as I recall. And then put those 14 down there at Guantanamo. He was trying to put some people down there who were actually guilty, in case anybody ever did, want to thoroughly vet the crowd down there and see how many of them were actually guilty of something worthy of being held there. And at the same time, he had to do it because, he had to begin to act like at least he was closing those prisons, because they become public knowledge. And as I recall, public knowledge included Thailand, Romania, Poland, maybe some other places too. And so our allies were really angry. So we had foreign ministers on the phone, what do you mean leaking this? In one case, as I recall, he didn't even know. And he was really mad, really angry. Joschka Fischer in Germany was really angry too. Not that he had a prison, but that we were doing that sort of thing. So Powell had a handful of foreign ministers on his hands who were asking us, what the hell were we doing? And Rumsfeld would not tell them anything. He wouldn't tell Powell anything. He wouldn't tell Condi anything. And Condi was incapable of disciplining the national security decision-making process. Utterly incapable. So once she figured that out, once she challenged Don, and Dick got on her back, challenged Don again, and Dick got on her back again. Didn't take her too long. She wasn't that stupid. She figured out, okay, I got two choices here. I discipline this decision-making process like I should do as National Security Advisor, and I tell Donald to shut his trap every now and then, and I tell the Vice President, as I can tell the Vice President, well, I don't think that's right, or whatever. As soon as I do that, I'm going to have both of them against me. And the only potential ally I have is Powell, and the President doesn't seem to be warm to Powell. And why wasn't the President warm to Powell? Because Karl Rove's whispering in his ear every week, your number one opponent in your attempt to win a second term just might be your Secretary of State. And Bush, I think, believed him, even though Powell knew this, so he was constantly telling the President, I serve at your discretion. I do not want to do anything else. I'll serve one term, and I'll serve at your discretion. He told him that. All the time he told him that. You know how politics is. The President's scared to death. His main opponent's sitting over there in Foggy Bottom. Mm-hmm. So that Powell never had a close relationship with the President. Condi had a choice. I discipline the system and get further and further away from this President, because I can smell he goes with Cheney more often than not. Or I get really close to the President and become Secretary of State. She made the latter decision. And the only person who affirmed that for me, interestingly enough, because I believed it from the moment I saw what was happening, I said it in the presence of Alma Powell one day, and Alma said, I'm glad you figured that out, Larry. That's exactly what's going on. He wouldn't believe it. He would not believe it. He bet me $50 Condi would go back to Stanford and go back to her academic job. She was sick and tired of the system, she said, and she was not going to have anything. I said, you are crazy, General Secretary. She's going to be Secretary of State. And he, no, I'll bet you that $50. We shook on it. He didn't pay me when she I'm in Korea on Punghwa 2004, as I recall, with Bill Perry playing our minister, and I was playing his Secretary of State. And the Koreans had their group on the other side. And the chairman of the Korean Joint Chiefs of Staff is sitting there watching everything, taking notes. That's the way they ran the simulation. And Bill Perry leans over to me right at a break, and he says, "Who do you think is going to be the next Secretary of State?" I said, "I don't think, Mr. Secretary. I know." He said, "Who?" I said, "Condi Rice." He said, "I had a notion that that might be it." I said, bet you. And I said, "I bet the Secretary." 3 days later, they announced it. And he said, "Man, you were clairvoyant." I said, "Not clairvoyant." I said, "I watched the bitch. I know she wanted the job." So that's the decision she made. I'm not going to be National Security Advisor. I'll be that in title. But what I'm going to be is his bosom buddy. And when he picks the next Secretary of State, it's going to be me. She got her wish.
So this
That was a very, on 13 January when Powell made his out call on the president, besides Andy Card not telling the president he was there and going to make his out call, which really pissed the president off. The Secret Service uniformed guard at the door told me that he thought Bush was going to kill Card because Bush didn't even know Powell was calling on him for his out call. And so Powell went inside and they closed the door. No vice president, nobody. And I believe Powell when he said, the first thing I said to the president after the pleasantries were over was I said, "You have the most dysfunctional decision-making process this presidency has ever had. I can't go back to Andrew Jackson, but I can tell you, since the act, the 1947 act, you have the most dysfunctional." And Bush at first said, "Well, you served with Schultz and Weinberger and Reagan. That was terrible, and you know it was." And Powell said, "Mr. President, yours is orders of magnitude worse." And he said, then the president sat down and listened to him for an hour and a half. Just a few months later, he fired Rumsfeld. And a few months after that, he put Cheney in the closet. And he empowered Condi over at Foggy Bottom to be a fairly powerful Secretary of State. So I like to think Powell's lecture of the president had some impact on him. I can't believe that after 4 years, the president didn't realize he was being run around the old whirligig by the vice president.
You don't think his father, George H.W. Bush, had any...
Wouldn't say anything.
Okay.
The one time he tried, he used Brent as an emissary. And Brent came to see Secretary Powell. I was in the office for part of that. He came to see Secretary Powell, and the reason I left the office was because Powell gave me the nod because Brent gave him the nod, "Let's do this by ourselves," So I went back in my office. We had adjoining offices. And Powell told me afterwards, he says, "Brent has been commissioned by Daddy to come read the Riot Act to Son. And he's going over there and do that." And then about 2 days later, I made the query of the secretary. I said, "What happened, by the way, with Brent's visit at the White House?" No impact. Brent came back through. I didn't know that, but he came back through to tell Powell. Wasted trip.
So what, well, it's been talked about a lot, the UN and Powell before them, but more particularly what was going on as far as war was actually being prepared as far as what you could see with the military and
Well, I knew what was going on with Tommy Franks from the point of view of the people in the Pentagon who would still talk to me. They couldn't stop us from making telephone calls. I knew that Franks was taking his eye off Afghanistan and focusing on Iraq. And then I got a rude awakening in mid-January when Powell walked into my office and he said, "I want you to go to the White House this Saturday, White House Situation Room, 1 o'clock. They're going to have a meeting to decide how they're going to sell the war to the American people," and this was important, "if the president makes a decision to go to war." And I remember I almost asked the question, "Isn't that assumed now?" I was not quite where Powell was. I assumed we were going to go to war. Powell was still really, after the November 8th UNSCR 1441, I think it was, 15-0 vote, Powell was confident he could get a second vote. a second resolution that would explicitly authorize the use of force. Wouldn't be a hint like the one in November. It would be explicit authorization for the use of force. He was disabused of that by Dominique de Villepin, the French foreign minister, who told him not only will France veto, Russia will too. And that was on the floor of the UN about a week later, and that killed that. Knew we weren't going to get it. The big deal was Blair, because Blair thought, even with the major majority he had in his parliament, Labor majority, he felt he'd lose a vote if he didn't have a second resolution. So Tony Blair was walking on ice those 3 days. And then the vote was very close, but it went for war. So we didn't need the second resolution. But that's why Kofi Annan said right after, this is an illegal war. It's an illegal war. We did not bless this war. Made an eternal enemy of George W. Bush. But at the time I went to that meeting, I was under the personal impression, that the march to war was already on, but that my boss might be powerful enough to slow it down at least, arrest it a bit. I knew he'd told the president that it was based a lot on weather. Most people don't understand this either that aren't military professionals. It was. You either used it or you had to wait a year. Mm-hmm. And so, the president was aware of that. Franks had made him very aware of it. And so he was antsy that he would miss his opportunity, that the weather would preclude an invasion and we'd have to wait for another good period. So I'm going to this meeting. Now remember, Steve Hadley is in the chair. He's the Deputy National Security Advisor. And the meeting, Steve announces it as, if we should choose to use force against Iraq, how would we want to use the media and so forth in order to keep them informed? And he didn't say propagandize. That's damn well what he meant. Keep them informed and to get them on our side and that sort of thing. So the meeting commenced. About every 5 minutes, Doug Feith jumps up. He was the Defense Department rep. He jumps up from his chair and he says, "You gentlemen," and you know how hard it is to jump up from your chair in the White House Situation Room. You're packed in there. If you're around the table, you're packed in there. You aren't talking about Al-Qaeda enough. We have to emphasize Al-Qaeda. We have to emphasize Saddam Hussein's context. He even brought up the infamous meeting that everyone had been disabused of. What was it, the Prague deal or whatever? Mm-hmm. And Steve finally, about the third remonstrance from Feith, says, "Sit down, Mr. Secretary. Please, you're disturbing the meeting." And Steve Hadley is a gentleman. I mean, he's not going to do something like that unless it really gets out of hand. He sat him down and told him to shut up, in essence. And then the real spokesman became, I've lost his name, but he was Rumsfeld's speechwriter. I can't remember. He was the one who probably should have been there, because we're talking about how speeches are going to be written, media is going to be used and so forth. Can't remember his name now. Pretty decent guy. Writes op-eds for the Washington Post now. I can't remember his name, but he's there. And so he kind of took over defense's position, and Feith sort of shut his mouth. But I'm listening to this, and I go back and I tell Powell, I said, we're going to war. We're going to war, and the Defense Department's already made up its mind that the major rationale for it is going to be Saddam's connections with 9/11. I mean, that's give and deal. He didn't have any connections with 9/11. I know that. You know that. But Feith didn't know that. Feith may know it, but he's lied. Okay. So that turns out to be the thing Powell fought hardest out at the CIA. And I've told this story many times. A whole chapter in my manuscript is about this. About the fourth day, he physically accosted me. He'd never done that before. He was really angry. And he's much bigger than I was. He's dragging me down the spaces in the National Intelligence Complex there. Not the CIA proper, but the NIE, what do they call it? National Intelligence Committee or Council or something like that. NIC is what they call it. Nick. I'm drugged down the hall. He opens the door. The room's empty. He throws me in there in a room with a long table and a bunch of chairs, and he closes the door and he says, "We're alone in there, aren't we?" I said, "Boss, it is the CIA." He didn't crack a smile. I thought at least he would smile. It is the CIA. Looks at me and he says, I want all that shit about Al-Qaeda, about the connections, about who begat whom, about Abu Nidal, about Abu Musab al-Zarqawi. I want all that Deuteronomy shit. That's the phrase he used, that Deuteronomy shit. You know, Ahab begat. I want all that out. It is trash. Take it out. I think he thought I was going to object. I looked at him and I smiled and I said, done, boss. It does. It stinks. It stinks, and there's absolutely no hard evidence for it. So he said, okay, good. Do it. So we had about an hour before we resumed rehearsal in the DCI's conference room. I went to Lynn Davidson, who was his principal speechwriter, and sitting at the computer and, you know, bleary-eyed, drafting the whole thing. And I told her I thought she'd be really angry, but she thought it stunk too. And she said, good, I'll go through and pull it all out. She did. Well, I didn't realize who was leaning against the door until I turned around. Stupid me. I was so hungover from lack of sleep at that point. Not an excuse, but I didn't put two and two together. John McLaughlin was leaning against the door, the deputy CIA director. John was the real intelligence professional and the real liar in all of this. John disappears. He's heard everything I told Lynn. We resumed the rehearsal. 15 minutes into the rehearsal, Powell's here. I'm sitting to his left. Tennett's sitting to his right. Rich is over here. Condi's over here. And George gets up to leave. Well, I'm trying to hide my anger because I had told George, don't ever leave when the secretary's in the chair. Because if he has a question, it's going to be right to you. Not to the analyst, right to you. Unless he personally directs it to the analyst, it's to you. That's my instruction from the secretary to you. You want to check with him, fine. And George said, no, I don't have any problem with that. You know? So he left. So I'm seething, you know. Here we are, 2 days left of New York, and we're barely rudimentary in our rehearsal, and he leaves.
You talking about Tennant?
Tennant, yeah, he left. 15 minutes he left. I was getting ready. We were going to take a break anyway. I was getting ready to go find him and just let my lieutenant colonel ass weigh on his head. And he comes back in. He sits down, smirk on his face, as only George could do, that Greek smirk, I call it. And he lets about 2 more minutes of rehearsal go. Powell is essentially asking Robert Walpole a question, and it ends. And then George puts his hand on the secretary's arm and he says, Mr. Secretary, I'm so close I can quote this verbatim. I hear every word of it. Mr. Secretary, we have just learned from high-level Al-Qaeda operative under interrogation of significant contacts between the Mukhabarat and Al-Qaeda, to include the training of Al-Qaeda operatives in the use of chemical and biological weapons. Powell looked at him and said, that's corroborated? Absolutely, Mr. Secretary. Turned to me and said, LW, put it all back in. And we did, and that was the most powerful element of the presentation with the American people. When he looked straight into the camera and he says, not in this age of post 9/11 concerns. And he's talking about the connection between Saddam Hussein and Al-Qaeda, which was bogus, completely bogus. We found out later that it was Sheikh al-Libi, that he was tortured mercilessly in Cairo by the Egyptians, that the DIA put a burn notice out on it almost immediately because 3 or 4 days after Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, or not Mohammed, al-Libi, Sheikh al-Libi had been tortured, he recanted. And he said, I'd have done anything to get the torture to stop. Not only that, there were no U.S. personnel present, just like with Curveball. There was never a U.S. CIA operative. Tyler Drumheller confirmed this for me in Europe. He was a CIA man in Europe. There was never a U.S. operative present with the B&D when Curveball, so-called Curveball, was questioned. Never a U.S. operative. And Tenet presented that as finished intelligence to Powell. And he never had a U.S. person in the room with this guy while he was questioned. Never had a U.S. person meet him. He wouldn't allow Tyler to meet him. So these things began to make themselves apparent to me throughout the summer of 2004. And, you know, I went to Tenant, and I said, I told you to give me everything that was even looked like a burn notice on any of this stuff. Not only that, I told you that the secretary said he wanted 4 independently corroborable sources, mass-int, SIG-int, HUMIT, whatever they were. He wanted 4 corroborating sources that were independent of one another. You gave us one source, a freaking B&D run, irresolute, former Iraqi lying sack of shit for the mobile biological labs. And Tenant said, well, there was a computer glitch on the burn notice, and Tenant was just out of it by that time. That was when he was getting ready for his Georgetown speech, when he went up on the stage at Georgetown University, and he said, and I quote, I never said that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. I'm watching the TV and I'm going, George, are you shitting me? You never said that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass. You must have said it 40 times in my presence. Anyway, that was a bunch of lying sacks. And I say that about McLaughlin more than Tenant, because Tenant was a political type. I mean, he come from the Hill. He had a little intelligence experience, but George was the 28, 29-year veteran of the CIA. John was. And, I mean, John he manufactured that stuff, and he did it for one reason, in my view, and my students supported me on this. The vice president made 11 trips to the CIA, unprecedented. And to say that 11 trips to the CIA by the vice president, speaking to 2 analysts, Larry Gershwin and Robert Walpole, both from WinPAC, that's not inordinate influence. Now, these 2 guys, who were the sole analysts that Powell was exposed to by Tenant and McLaughlin during the time we were preparing, got bonuses and promotions afterwards. And they just participated in one of the greatest intelligence failure post-World War II.
Or greatest intelligence frauds.
I think it wasn't a failure. I think it was a fraud. And I think they were working, both of them, for the vice president, in addition to working for the DCI, because they weren't CIA, they were under the DCI.
So how dirty was the CIA beyond McLaughlin?
Well,
how supportive of the war were they?
Another mistake I made, I asked Powell if I could take Karl Rove over with me. Karl Rove. Jesus. Man, my mind's going. Our guy, INR, Carl. It'll come to me. Our Assistant Secretary for Intelligence Research. Because I knew that our group had said, at least powerfully, at the consortium meeting of all the intelligence agencies, 16 at that time, they had descended on the active nuclear program, which was the most powerful program, if you think about it. It was the only program Powell said he was worried about, was the nuclear program. They had descended so hard, so loudly and volubly, that Tenant put a footnote in the October 2002 National Intelligence Assessment. INR does not agree. And they insisted on it. So I wanted to take him over with me to the CIA, and I told Powell that when he charged me to do this. And he said, no, he's mine. I know how he thinks. I can talk to him anytime I want to. And I said, no, what I want him for is to help me stand up to Tenant. I'm not a professional intelligence expert. I'm not someone who, I've used a lot of intelligence, tactical, operational, and strategic, but I'm not an expert in evaluating it and, saying this source is reliable, this source isn't, and so forth. I want to take him over there. He said, no. I said, well, let me take Tom Finger. He was his deputy. He was Carl's deputy. Why do you want to take Tom? I said, well, because I like Tom more than I do Carl. Tom comes up and briefs me every day on things, and I know Tom is reliable. Tom works for me too. You're not taking any of our people there. Big mistake on my part. I should have taken one of those people, especially Tom, because Tom was the kind of guy who would tell Tenant he was naked as shit. He was wearing no clothes. The emperor's naked. He would have stood up to him on some of these things. And I didn't have the intelligence credentials to stand up to him. And frankly, Powell didn't have the volition to stand up to him, because Powell had been given the mandate by the president. You are going to give this presentation. So what we boiled down to doing about the 4th or 5th day, when we realized time was running out, was perfecting the technical aspects of the presentation. Only later in the Waldorf Astoria at 2 a.m. in the morning, the night of the presentation, the morning of the presentation, 7 hours later, we're going to be on the UN Security Council floor. I'm sitting at the computer and I'm taking shit out of the presentation, especially torture stuff, especially terrorist stuff. Phil Mudd comes into my room. How he found out what I was doing, I don't know. It is the CIA. Tenant was staying in another hotel. He comes up behind me. I didn't even know he was there. Barry Lowenkron had let him into the room. And he's got his hand on my shoulder. And he says, I understand you're changing some things in the presentation. I didn't even know who it was. I said, you damn straight I am. It's too long. Powell didn't like it. We just done a full dress rehearsal in the cafeteria of the US-UN Mission Building in New York. Full dress rehearsal, everything. I'd set it up just like the UN Security Council, placards and everything, you know. And Powell had gone through the whole thing, an hour and 27 minutes. And he said, he looked at me afterwards and he said, too long. It's too long. Cut it to about an hour 15 at max. And realize if you cut it to an hour 15, I'll make it an hour 30 because of the way I talk. I said, okay, no problem. I'm going to take all that shit out. He said, do it. So I'm back. I'm taking all the stuff out. Phil looks at me and he says, looks like to me you're taking stuff about Saddam's connection with terrorists out. I said, yep, that's the weakest part of the presentation. I'm taking it out. That's not what you should be doing. I'm going back and tell George. I said, fine, go tell him. You want me to call him on the phone? I was mad. I was really mad by that time. They just charged me $45 for a hamburger in the Waldorf. I was mad for a lot of reasons. But anyway, next morning, 9 o'clock, I'm still bleary-eyed, you know. I'm standing on it's about 8:45. I'm standing on the floor of the National Security Council, or the UN Security Council. And Scott Sforza comes over. Oh God, if I hadn't had him, we'd never got it together. About the third day, I called Condi and I said, Condi, the CIA is absolutely incompetent in terms of visual presentations. I need your White House team. And she said, okay, you got it. I'll send Scott over. So Scott Forsey came over and said, what do you need? And he brought everything. So then it's picked up a little bit in the presentation quality and the technical aspect. Well, the Challenger went down, remember, on that Saturday. So she pulled Scott away because the president was going to do a full-blown audio-visual blah, blah, blah with Houston. Then I said, okay, we're doomed. Then I called Steve, and Steve said, the president's decided not to do it, so you got your team back. So here I am on the floor of the UN Security Council, and Scott is doing everything from taking the secretary's tie knot and burying the microphone in it, you know, typical Hollywood-type stuff. And George comes up to me and puts his arm around me and says, I understand last night you were cutting the presentation. Phil Mudd, you asshole. Yeah, I was, Mr. Director. Oh, by the way, your chair's right up there where the secretary told you it would be. You're to be sitting in camera with him. Oh, I know that. I said, yeah, okay. He said, well, you shouldn't have been doing that. I said, well, I did. And he looked at me and gave me that Greek smile, you know, and he said, well, that's all right. It's pretty powerful as it is. And he went up and took his chair, and we started. And I thought, well, I got away with that one. But, you know, left that powerful line in there about the connection with Al-Qaeda. And that was all based on Sheikh al-Libi. And so when I found out later that it was all a big fucking lie about Sheikh al-Libi, I was furious. And then Powell comes in late August, and he says, turn on your computer and look at the CIA site. Okay, now go there. Okay, go there. Okay. Wow, look at that. Georgia's still got the mobile biological labs up on the site. And he said, the guy will not fall off of it. He's still advertising those helium balloon filling apparatus for artillery barrage balloons. He's still billing them as the mobile biological laboratories. Is that guy sick or what? And he went back in his office. And I looked at it and I said, oh God. 3 days later, they came down. I think he made a call. And he said, hey, George, everything in my presentation that was a pillar of that presentation is a farce, including that. Take your photos down.